Picture this. Christmas morning, 2024. While most grandmothers were waking up in warm beds, surrounded by the excited squeals of grandchildren opening presents, I was peeling my aching back off a lumpy couch cushion that had become my permanent sleeping arrangement. The throw pillow had long lost its fluff, and the thin blanket barely covered my arthritis-riddled joints. But what hurt more than my physical discomfort was hearing my own daughter whispering to her husband in the kitchen about how much longer they'd have to deal with Mom taking up space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That was the moment I realized that 23 years of sacrificing everything for my family had earned me nothing more than a spot on their second-hand furniture. But they had no idea that their burden was about to become their biggest financial nightmare. My name is Margaret Ellen Thornfield, though everyone just called me Maggie. At 71 years old, I had spent the better part of my adult life believing that family meant everything, that blood was thicker than water, and that a mother's love knew no bounds. Those beliefs had cost me more than I ever imagined possible, but they also became the very foundation upon which I would build my revenge. The story really begins 3 years ago, when my husband Robert passed away from complications related to his diabetes. Robert had been my anchor for 47 years, the steady presence who helped me navigate the choppy waters of raising our daughter Christina. He was a railroad engineer, methodical and reliable, with hands that could fix anything, and a heart that loved deeply but quietly. When the doctor delivered the news that the infection had spread too far, that there was nothing more they could do, I felt like my entire world had shifted off its axis. Christina seemed devastated at the funeral. She wept dramatically during the eulogy, clutching her husband Marcus's arm as if she might collapse from grief. She spoke beautifully about her father, painting him as a devoted family man who had taught her the value of hard work and integrity. I remember feeling so proud of her in that moment, grateful that despite our sometimes complicated relationship, she truly understood what kind of man her father had been. But grief has a way of revealing people's true nature, and Christina's mask began to slip almost immediately after we lowered Robert into the ground. The house Robert and I had shared for 32 years was a modest 2-story colonial in Millbrook, Connecticut. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was ours. The mortgage had been paid off for 15 years, and Robert had been meticulous about maintenance. The furnace was barely 5 years old. The roof had been replaced just before his diagnosis, and the kitchen still sparkled from the renovation we'd completed the previous summer. It was the kind of home that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and hard work. Within a week of the funeral, Christina approached me with what she called a practical solution to a difficult situation. She had always been persuasive, even as a child, with an ability to make her requests sound perfectly reasonable even when they were anything but. She explained that the house was too big for me now, too much responsibility for someone my age. Wouldn't I be happier in a smaller place, somewhere I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work? And since she and Marcus were struggling with their mortgage payments, perhaps it would make sense for me to sell the house and come live with them. The way she presented it, I would be doing them a favor by allowing them to help me. I would contribute what I could toward household expenses, and in return they would take care of me as I aged. It sounded like a mutually beneficial arrangement, the kind of intergenerational living situation that had worked for families for centuries. I should have trusted my instincts when something deep in my gut told me this was a mistake. I should have paid attention to the way Marcus's eyes lit up when Christina mentioned the equity in my house, or the way they both seemed to have already calculated exactly how much my monthly Social Security check would contribute to their budget. But I was grieving, lonely, and desperate to feel like I still had a family that wanted me around. The house sold for $347,000. After paying the real estate fees and settling a few remaining medical bills from Robert's final hospitalization, I walked away with just over $300,000. It was more money than I'd ever had in a bank account at one time, the accumulated wealth of a lifetime of modest living and careful saving. Christina and Marcus lived in a cramped ranch house in West Hartford, about 40 minutes from where Robert and I had built our life together. The neighborhood was newer but already showing signs of wear, with small yards and houses built too close together. Their mortgage payment was nearly $3,000 a month, a figure that seemed astronomical to me considering what Robert and I had paid for our much larger home decades earlier. They assured me that the living arrangement would be temporary, just until they could find a bigger place that would give us all more space and privacy. In the meantime, I would stay in what they generously called the guest room, though it was really just a converted den with no closet and thin walls that transmitted every sound from the rest of the house. I contributed $2,000 a month toward household expenses, nearly my entire Social Security check. Christina explained that this covered my share of the mortgage, utilities, food, and various household costs. When I suggested that seemed like a lot for one person, she patiently broke down all the expenses I wasn't considering: the heating bill in winter, the increased grocery costs, the wear and tear on the house, the inconvenience of having to accommodate another person's schedule and needs. The way she explained it, they were practically subsidizing my living situation out of the goodness of their hearts. Looking back now, I can see how systematically they began to isolate me from my old life. My friends from Millbrook were too far away to visit regularly. The senior center where I had volunteered for 15 years became impractical to reach without my own transportation. Christina had convinced me to sell my car along with the house, arguing that I was getting too old to drive safely and that I could always borrow theirs when necessary. Of course, borrowing their car required advance notice, a detailed explanation of where I was going and why, and often resulted in sighs and eye-rolling about the inconvenience of being without a vehicle. It was easier to just stay home and find ways to occupy myself within the increasingly narrow confines of their world. Marcus worked in software sales, which apparently required him to be on conference calls at all hours, and to maintain an image of success with his client. This meant the house needed to be quiet during his work-from-home days, which seemed to be most days. Christina had a part-time job at a boutique clothing store, but she was always talking about how exhausting retail work was and how much she needed to decompress when she got home. Gradually, my presence in their home began to feel less like a welcome addition and more like an unwelcome intrusion. I found myself tiptoeing around, keeping my television volume low, limiting my time in the kitchen, and generally trying to make myself as invisible as possible. When I mentioned this to Christina, she assured me I was being overly sensitive, that of course I was welcome in their home, but perhaps I could be a bit more mindful of the fact that they had their own routines and responsibilities to manage. The first Christmas after I moved in should have been a warning sign, but I was still operating under the illusion that we were a family learning to live together harmoniously. Christina had always loved Christmas, and I expected that my presence would add to the holiday warmth rather than detract from it. I offered to help with cooking, decorating, and gift buying, drawing on decades of experience hosting holiday celebrations in my own home. But Christina had very specific ideas about how Christmas should be handled in her house. The decorations were modern and minimalist, nothing like the warm traditional ornaments Robert and I had collected over the years. The menu was simplified, with most items purchased rather than homemade, and the gift exchange was carefully budgeted and coordinated to avoid any duplication or excess. I spent $800 on presents that year, wanting to contribute meaningfully to the celebration and show my appreciation for being included in their home. I bought Marcus an expensive watch I'd seen him admiring in a catalog, and Christina received a beautiful necklace I'd found at a jewelry store near her workplace. For their children from Marcus's previous marriage, who visited every other weekend, I chose carefully selected books and games that I thought would encourage their creativity and learning. Christmas morning, I woke up on the living room couch where I'd been relegated because Christina's sister and her family were visiting for the holiday. The guest room, my usual sleeping space, had been needed for real guests, as Christina had explained it. I had spent a cold, uncomfortable night trying to find a position that didn't aggravate my sciatica, listening to the house settle, and wondering when exactly I had stopped being considered a real member of this family. The gift exchange was perfunctory and brief. Marcus thanked me politely for the watch but mentioned that he actually preferred digital timepieces for their fitness tracking capabilities. Christina admired the necklace but noted that it wasn't really her style, and perhaps she could exchange it for something more practical. The children were more enthusiastic, but they were quickly swept up in the excitement of their other presents and forgot about mine within minutes. In return, I received a generic gift card to a department store and a small potted plant that Christina explained would be perfect for brightening up my room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The contrast between my $800 in carefully chosen gifts and their obvious last-minute afterthoughts was stark enough that even Christina's sister seemed to notice the disparity. But it was during the cleanup after Christmas dinner that I overheard the conversation that should have opened my eyes to reality. I was gathering plates from the dining room when I heard Christina and her sister talking in the kitchen, their voices low but not quite low enough. "How much longer are you planning to have Mom living here?" her sister asked. "God, I don't know," Christina replied, her voice heavy with irritation. "The money's helpful, obviously, but she's always and Marcus is getting really frustrated with having to be quiet during his calls and not being able to use the living room when he wants to relax. Can't you find her a nice senior community somewhere? With what money? She gives us everything from Social Security, and we need every penny to keep this place afloat. Marcus's commission was down last quarter, and my hours got cut after the holidays. We're barely making the mortgage as it is. What about that money from selling her house?" There was a pause, and when Christina spoke again, her voice had a calculating edge that made my blood run cold. "Most of that went toward paying down our credit card debt and catching up on some bills. There's still some left, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. If we're smart, we can make this arrangement work for both of us for quite a while longer." I stood frozen in the dining room, dirty plates still in my hands, as the full scope of my situation became clear. I wasn't a beloved family member being cared for in my golden years. I was a financial resource being managed and exploited by people who saw my presence as an inconvenience to be endured in exchange for monetary benefit. The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. I quietly set the plates down and retreated to the living room, where I would spend another night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I had allowed myself to become so completely dependent on people who clearly saw me as nothing more than a burden with a bank account. That was the night I began to understand that the family I thought I had was an illusion, and that the comfortable retirement I'd planned for had been systematically dismantled by the very people I'd trusted most. But it was also the night I began to plan my escape, though I had no idea yet just how dramatically the tables would turn. The months following that Christmas were a masterclass in subtle psychological manipulation. Christina and Marcus had perfected the art of making me feel guilty for taking up space while simultaneously making it clear that leaving was not a financially viable option. Every time I mentioned feeling like I was imposing, they would reassure me that family took care of family, that they were happy to have me, and that I shouldn't worry about being a burden. But their actions told a different story. When I used the washing machine during the day, Christina would later mention how expensive the utility bills were getting. If I watched television in the evening, Marcus would pointedly put on his headphones or retreat to the bedroom, making it clear that my presence was disrupting his relaxation time. When I cooked meals, which I tried to do as a way of contributing beyond just money, Christina would later reorganize the kitchen and make comments about how she preferred to keep things arranged in a specific way. I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, except that I was paying rent and had nowhere else to go. My old friends from Millbrook called less frequently, partly because Christina had mentioned that I was adjusting to a new phase of life and needed space to settle into my new living situation. When I tried to make plans to visit them, there always seemed to be some complication with borrowing the car or some family obligation that required my presence at home. The isolation was deliberate and effective. Cut off from my support network, financially dependent, and constantly made to feel like an inconvenience, I found myself becoming smaller and more accommodating by the day. I stopped expressing opinions about household decisions, stopped asking to use the car, and stopped expecting to be included in family activities beyond the most basic level. My bedroom became my refuge, the one space where I could exist without feeling like I was in the way. I spent hours reading library books, working on crossword puzzles, and writing letters to old friends that I never sent because I didn't want to admit how isolated and dependent I'd become. The room had a small window that looked out onto the backyard, and I would sit there for hours watching the seasons change, feeling like a prisoner in a life I'd never chosen. Spring brought new challenges as Christina announced that they'd decided to convert the den into a home office for Mark. His software sales required more professional-looking video conference capabilities, and my bedroom was the perfect size and location for his needs. I would be moving to the basement, which they promised to fix up to be more comfortable for me. The basement was finished, technically, with carpet and drywall and adequate lighting, but it was also cold, damp, and completely cut off from the natural light and human activity that had made the den bearable. The ceiling was low enough that I bumped my head if I wasn't careful, and the narrow windows near the ceiling provided only glimpses of feet and car tires from the street above. Christina and Marcus made a show of buying me a small space heater and a dehumidifier, explaining that these would make the basement more comfortable for me. They also installed a small television and helped me arrange my furniture to make the best use of the limited space. But no amount of decorating could disguise the fact that I was being moved further away from the family I'd supposedly come to live with, relegated to the least desirable space in a house I was helping to pay for. The basement became both my sanctuary and my prison. I was grateful for the privacy and the distance from Marcus's increasingly frequent conference calls, but I was also acutely aware that I was being hidden away like an embarrassing family secret. When Christina's friends visited, there was no mention of me living downstairs. When the children from Marcus's previous marriage came for their visits, I was expected to stay in the basement to give them full run of the upstairs. It was during this period of exile that I began to seriously consider my options. I had been living with Christina and Marcus for nearly 2 years, and the temporary arrangement showed no signs of evolving into something more sustainable or dignified. My contributions to their household had helped them stabilize their finances, pay down debt, and even take a vacation to Mexico that I was not invited to join despite helping to fund it. But my own financial situation had become precarious in ways I was only beginning to understand. The $300,000 from selling my house had been gradually depleted through a series of emergencies and investments that Christina and Marcus had convinced me to fund. When their water heater failed, I contributed $3,000 for a high-efficiency replacement. When Marcus's car needed major repairs, I helped cover the $4,000 bill because his commission check was delayed. When Christina wanted to take a course to advance her career, I paid the $1,500 tuition because it was an investment in our family's future. Each request was reasonable in isolation, presented as a temporary loan or a strategic investment that would benefit all of us in the long run, but the loans were never repaid and the investments never seemed to generate the promised return. After nearly 2 years of these periodic emergencies, my nest egg had shrunk to less than $100,000, and I was beginning to understand that my financial security was being systematically dismantled under the guise of family cooperation. The second Christmas in their house was when the sleeping on the couch arrangement became a tradition rather than an exception. Christina explained that with Marcus's children visiting and her mother coming for the holiday, space was simply too tight to accommodate everyone comfortably. I would need to give up the basement bedroom for the weekend and sleep on the living room couch, but her mother never arrived, having canceled at the last minute due to a minor illness. Marcus's children spent most of their time at their mother's house, only coming for Christmas dinner itself. And yet I remained on the couch for the entire week, listening to them laugh and celebrate upstairs, while I tried to find a comfortable position on furniture that had never been designed for sleeping. It was Christmas morning of that second year that I finally understood my place in this family hierarchy. I woke up at dawn, my neck stiff and my back aching, to find Marcus in the kitchen making coffee. He glanced at me with barely concealed irritation as I folded the blankets and tried to restore the living room to its daytime configuration. "Sorry about the couch situation," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "Hopefully next year we'll have figured out a better solution." I nodded and smiled, because that's what I had trained myself to do. But as I watched him prepare breakfast for his children and Christina, making no offer to include me in the morning routine, I realized that there would be no better solution next year. This was my life now, a paying guest in someone else's home, relegated to whatever space was convenient for the real family, tolerated rather than welcomed. That Christmas morning, As I sat on the couch that had become my bed, watching them exchange gifts that I had helped to fund, but had no hand in choosing, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find a way out of this situation, and I was going to make sure that the people who had taken advantage of my love and trust understood exactly what they were losing. I just had no idea yet how dramatically the universe was about to provide me with the perfect opportunity to do exactly that. The opportunity came on a gray Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 months after that miserable Christmas on the couch. I was sorting through old mail in the basement, a task that had become one of my few remaining responsibilities since Christina had taken over managing most of my financial affairs to make things easier for everyone. Hidden beneath a stack of medical bills and insurance statements, I found an envelope that had been opened and carelessly resealed. Inside was a letter from Pemberton and Associates, a law firm in Hartford that I didn't recognize. The letter was dated 6 weeks earlier, addressed to me personally, and contained information that made my hands shake as I read it. My great-aunt Cordelia, my father's sister who had moved to Arizona decades ago, and with whom I'd lost touch years before Robert's death, had passed away the previous November. As her only surviving relative, I was the sole beneficiary of her estate. The lawyers had been trying to reach me for months. According to their letter, Aunt Cordelia had been far more successful than any of us had realized. Her modest investment in Arizona real estate in the 1970s had grown into a substantial portfolio, and her careful financial planning had resulted in an estate worth approximately $1.8 million. After taxes and legal fees, I stood to inherit just over $1.3 million. The letter requested that I contact them immediately to begin the probate process and arrange for the transfer of funds. They had sent previous correspondence that had apparently been intercepted, and they were concerned about the delay in reaching me. They needed verification of my identity and current living situation before they could proceed with the inheritance. I sat on my basement bed, reading and rereading the letter, trying to process what this meant. For the past 2 years I had felt financially vulnerable and completely dependent on Christina and Marcus's questionable generosity. I had watched my life savings dwindle through their various emergencies and needs, always reassured that we were all in this together, that family took care of family, but this inheritance changed everything. This was money that Christina and Marcus knew nothing about, money that could give me the independence I had lost when I sold my house and moved into their carefully controlled world. For the first time in years I had options, real choices about how I wanted to live the rest of my life. The challenge was figuring out how to contact the lawyers without Christina and Marcus discovering what was happening. They monitored my mail, ostensibly to help me stay organized, but really to maintain control over my financial affairs. They had convinced me to add Christina's name to my checking account for convenience, which meant she could see every transaction I made. My phone calls were often overheard in the small house, and my computer time was limited since I had to use the shared family laptop in the living room. I realized I needed to be strategic and careful. If Christina and Marcus discovered this inheritance before I could secure it independently, they would find ways to convince me that the money should be used for family needs, household improvements, or shared investments that would ultimately benefit them more than me. I had seen their pattern of financial manipulation too clearly to trust them with knowledge of this windfall. Over the next few days, I began planning my approach. During my weekly trip to the grocery store, one of the few solo activities I was still permitted, I would find a way to call the law firm from a payphone or borrow someone's cell phone. I needed to verify the inheritance, understand the legal requirements, and figure out how to receive the money without alerting Christina and Marcus to what was happening. But before I could put this plan into action, an unexpected opportunity presented itself that would make everything both simpler and more complicated. Christina announced that she and Marcus were planning a long weekend trip to visit her college friend in Boston. It would be their first vacation without children or extended family obligations, a chance for them to reconnect and recharge their relationship. They would be leaving Friday morning and returning Monday evening, giving me 4 full days of privacy and independence in the house. Initially, they debated whether to take me along or arrange for someone to check on me while they were gone. Christina worried aloud about leaving me alone for so long, expressing concern about my ability to manage household tasks and handle any emergencies that might arise. But Marcus pointed out that hotel accommodations for 3 people would significantly increase their travel costs, and Christina ultimately decided that I was responsible enough to manage on my own for a few days. They left detailed instructions about emergency contacts, household maintenance, and expectations for my behavior while they were away. I was not to have any visitors without prior approval. I was not to make any major purchases or financial decisions. I was to keep the house clean and secure, water Christina's plants, and generally maintain the status quo until their return. I smiled and nodded and promised to be the perfect house sitter, all while knowing that I was about to use their absence to fundamentally alter the balance of power in our relationship. The moment their car disappeared around the corner Friday morning, I was on the phone with Pemberton and Associates. The receptionist connected me to James Morrison, the attorney handling Aunt Cordelia's estate, and within minutes I was providing the verification information they needed to confirm my identity and begin the inheritance process. James Morrison was professional but warm, explaining that they had been increasingly concerned about the delay in reaching me. He had even considered hiring a private investigator to locate me, but the letter I had found had been their final attempt before taking more aggressive measures. He assured me that the inheritance was legitimate and substantial, and that they could begin transfer procedures immediately once the paperwork was completed. The most pressing issue was establishing where I wanted the funds to be deposited. My current checking account shared with Christina was obviously not an option. James Morrison recommended that I open a new account at a different bank, one that would give me complete privacy and control over the inheritance money. He could recommend several institutions that specialized in estate transfers and wealth management for seniors. That same Friday afternoon, I took a taxi to downtown Hartford and opened a new checking account at First National Bank, an institution I chose specifically because it was not where Christina and Marcus did their banking. I used my basement address but requested that all correspondence be held at the bank rather than mailed to the house. I also arranged for online banking access using a password that Christina would never guess, ensuring that I could monitor the account without leaving any digital trail on the shared family computer. The inheritance transfer would take approximately 10 days to complete, James Morrison explained. Once the funds were available, I would have complete discretion over how to use them. There were no restrictions or conditions attached to Aunt Cordelia's bequest, no requirements that I inform family members or include them in financial decisions. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I had agency over my own life. The weekend passed quietly as I began to plan my next steps. I researched independent living communities in Connecticut, looking for places that would give me the dignity and autonomy I had lost in Christina's house. I investigated the legal requirements for reclaiming the money I had contributed to their household expenses and property improvement. I began to understand that I had options beyond simply leaving, that I could potentially recover some of the financial losses I had sustained through their manipulation. But it was Sunday evening, as I sat in the living room eating dinner and watching television without worrying about disturbing anyone, that I had the realization that would shape everything that followed. I didn't just want to escape from Christina and Marcus's exploitation. I wanted them to understand exactly what they were losing when they lost me. I wanted them to feel the same financial insecurity and powerlessness that they had imposed on me for 2 years. I wanted justice, not just freedom. Monday morning, I called James Morrison again with additional questions about the inheritance and my legal rights regarding the money I had already spent on Christina and Marcus's behalf. He listened carefully as I explained my living situation and the financial contributions I had made to their household over the past 2 years. From a legal standpoint, James Morrison explained, money given as gifts to family members was generally not recoverable. However, money provided under false pretenses or as part of an exploitative arrangement might be subject to different legal standards, particularly if I could demonstrate that I had been misled about the nature of our living arrangement or my financial obligation. He recommended that I document everything I could remember about the financial transactions between myself and Christina and Marcus: bank statements, receipts, written agreements, and any correspondence that showed how they had presented these financial requests to me. If I decided to pursue legal action, this documentation would be essential for establishing a pattern of exploitation. More immediately, he suggested that I consider how I wanted to handle the revelation of my changed financial circumstance. Did I want to inform Christina and Marcus about the inheritance directly, or did I prefer to simply leave and let them discover my improved situation later? Did I want to attempt to recover the money I had already given them, or was I more interested in simply protecting my future financial independence? These were questions I couldn't answer immediately, but I appreciated having a legal professional who understood that my situation was about more than just money. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to live my final years on my own terms rather than as a financial resource for people who saw my presence as an inconvenience to be endured. Christina and Marcus returned Monday evening full of stories about their wonderful weekend away. They had eaten at expensive restaurants, stayed in a luxury hotel, and enjoyed the kind of carefree recreation that their financial situation theoretically shouldn't have allowed. As they described their weekend, I couldn't help but calculate how much of their vacation had been funded by my monthly contributions to their household budget. But I smiled and listened and asked appropriate questions about their trip, because I wasn't ready to reveal what I had learned or what I was planning. I needed time to receive the inheritance, secure my new banking arrangements, and decide exactly how I wanted to handle the confrontation that was inevitably coming. Over the next week, I began to notice things about Christina and Marcus's behavior that I had either missed or ignored before. The way they discussed expensive purchases in front of me, knowing I would hear about their financial concerns and potentially offer to help. The way they left bills and financial statements where I could see them, creating a subtle pressure for me to contribute to their expenses. The way they framed every household expense as our responsibility, even when the benefits were clearly theirs alone. I also began to understand how systematically they had isolated me from potential sources of support or alternative perspective. My old friends from Millbrook had stopped calling, partly because Christina had told them I was adjusting to a new lifestyle and preferred not to be disturbed. My former volunteering commitments had been allowed to lapse because transportation was too complicated to arrange. Even my relationship with Robert's family had been minimized through a series of scheduling conflicts and competing obligations that always seemed to prevent meaningful contact. The isolation had been so gradual and seemingly reasonable that I had participated in it without fully realizing what was happening. But now, with the prospect of financial independence changing my perspective, I could see how deliberately they had cut me off from anyone who might have questioned their treatment of me or offered alternative living arrangements. Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after my initial call to James Morrison, I received confirmation that Aunt Cordelia's inheritance had been successfully transferred to my new bank account. $1.3 million was now under my complete control, a sum larger than any amount I had ever imagined having access to. I sat in my basement bedroom, looking at the bank confirmation on my phone, and felt a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something that might have been described as righteous anger. Aunt Cordelia had worked her entire life to build this wealth, probably living modestly and saving carefully to ensure her financial security in her final years. She had chosen to leave this money to me, trusting that I would use it wisely and honorably. Instead of allowing Christina and Marcus to gradually siphon away this inheritance the way they had depleted my previous savings, I was going to use it to reclaim my independence and show them the consequences of treating family members as financial resources, rather than human beings deserving of respect and dignity. The first step was securing a place to live that would reflect my new financial reality. That same Thursday afternoon, I took a taxi to Westfield Gardens, an upscale senior living community about 20 minutes from Christina's house. I had researched the facility online and knew it offered independent living apartments, with optional services for residents who wanted assistance with meals, housekeeping, or transportation. The community was beautiful, with well-maintained grounds, elegant common areas, and apartments that were spacious, bright, and designed specifically for seniors who wanted to maintain their independence while having access to support services when needed. The two-bedroom apartment I toured had floor-to-ceiling windows, a modern kitchen, and a balcony overlooking a landscaped courtyard where residents gathered for coffee and conversation. The monthly fee was substantial, nearly $4,000, but it included all utilities, housekeeping services, one prepared meal per day, transportation to shopping and medical appointments, and access to fitness facilities and social programs. Most importantly, it would give me privacy, independence, and the opportunity to build new relationships with people who saw me as Margaret Thornfield, a woman with her own interests and resources, rather than as Christina's mother who needed to be managed and tolerated. I signed a lease that same afternoon, providing first month's rent, plus a security deposit totaling nearly $10,000. The apartment would be available in 2 weeks, giving me time to arrange my departure from Christina's house and purchase the furniture and household items I would need for independent living. For the first time in 2 years, I was making decisions about my living situation based on what I wanted rather than what other people were willing to provide for me. That evening, as I sat in the basement listening to Christina and Marcus discussing their weekend plans upstairs, I began to plan how I would reveal my changed circumstances. I could simply leave, providing minimal explanation and letting them discover my financial independence later. I could tell them about the inheritance and my decision to move out, giving them time to adjust their own financial planning to account for the loss of my monthly contribution. Or I could orchestrate my departure in a way that would make them understand exactly what they were losing and exactly how they had contributed to that loss. Over the next few days, I began to implement a plan that would accomplish both goals simultaneously. I would secure my new living situation and establish my financial independence, but I would also ensure that Christina and Marcus experienced the same kind of financial uncertainty and powerlessness that they had imposed on me. The opportunity to put this plan into action came sooner than I expected, and it would involve the kind of dramatic confrontation that I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. Friday evening, Christina approached me in the basement with a familiar expression of concern mixed with calculation. She explained that Marcus had just learned about an incredible investment opportunity through one of his business contacts. A former client was developing a small commercial property and needed additional investors to complete the project. The returns were projected to be substantial, potentially doubling the initial investment within 18 months. The minimum investment was $50,000. Just slightly more than what remained in my accessible savings account. Christina had spent the day researching the opportunity and consulting with Marcus about the potential benefits for our family's financial future. They were prepared to invest their own money as well, but they needed my contribution to reach the minimum threshold. She presented this as an opportunity for all of us to build wealth together, a chance for me to see my money grow significantly rather than just sitting in a low-interest savings account. The investment would be in my name, ensuring that I retained control over the funds, but it would benefit all of us if the project succeeded as projected. As she spoke, I realized that this was the perfect opportunity to implement the plan I had been developing. Christina and Marcus were asking me to invest essentially all of my remaining accessible money in a speculative venture that would leave me completely financially dependent on them. They were counting on my pattern of agreeable compliance with their financial suggestions, assuming that I would go along with their plan just as I had with all their previous requests for money. They had no idea that my financial situation had changed dramatically, or that I was no longer the vulnerable, dependent woman they had been managing for the past 2 years. I told Christina that I needed time to think about such a significant financial decision, that I wanted to review my overall financial situation before committing to any major investment. She seemed surprised by my hesitation, since I had previously been quick to agree to their financial suggestions, but she accepted my request for a few days to consider the opportunity. That weekend I finalized my preparations for the confrontation that would change everything. I moved the most important of my personal belongings to a storage unit I had rented near my new apartment. I arranged for movers to collect my furniture the following Friday. I transferred enough money from my inheritance account to my old checking account to cover the investment Christina and Marcus had proposed, but I also prepared documentation that would make clear exactly where this money had come from and what it represented. Most importantly, I scheduled a meeting with James Morrison for the following Tuesday, asking him to prepare legal documentation that would formalize my intention to reclaim the money I had contributed to Christina and Marcus's household over the past 2 years. I wasn't certain I would pursue legal action, but I wanted them to understand that I now had the resources and legal support to challenge their treatment of me if I chose to do so. Monday evening, I told Christina that I had decided to make the investment they had proposed. She was delighted, thanking me for my confidence in their financial judgment, and promising that this decision would benefit all of us significantly. We arranged to meet with Marcus's contact on Wednesday afternoon to finalize the investment paperwork, but I also told her that I had some other financial matters to discuss, some changes in my living situation that we needed to address as a family. I suggested that we plan a family dinner for Friday evening, something special to celebrate our new investment partnership and discuss our future plans together. Christina agreed enthusiastically, apparently interpreting my willingness to invest as a sign that I was becoming more integrated into their financial planning and long-term goals. She had no idea that Friday's dinner would be the last meal I would share in her house, or that the investment I was agreeing to make would be the catalyst for revealing just how dramatically our relationship was about to change. As I lay on the basement bed Monday night, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about what the next week would bring. For 2 years I had accepted their treatment of me as the price of having a place to live and people who claimed to care about me. I had made myself smaller and quieter and more accommodating, hoping that my compliance would earn me the love and respect that I had lost when Robert died. But I was about to show Christina and Marcus that the woman they had been taking advantage of was far more resourceful and independent than they had realized, and I was going to ensure that they experienced firsthand the financial uncertainty and powerlessness that they had imposed on me through their careful manipulation and exploitation. The game was about to change completely, and this time, I would be the one setting the rule. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem more vivid and purposeful. I dressed carefully for the meeting with Marcus's investment contact, choosing clothes that projected quiet confidence rather than the apologetic demeanor I had cultivated for the past 2 years. Christina noticed the difference immediately, commenting that I seemed more energetic and optimistic than she had seen me in months. If only she knew why. The meeting took place at a coffee shop in downtown West Hartford, neutral territory that Marcus had chosen to make his contact feel comfortable. Richard Kellerman was exactly what I expected from Marcus's description: smooth, well-dressed, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that successful salespeople use to inspire confidence in their prospects. He had prepared a professional presentation folder with glossy photographs of the proposed commercial development, financial projections, and testimonials from previous investors. The project itself was legitimate: a small shopping center in a growing suburb that would house several retail businesses and a medical practice. The numbers looked reasonable, though not quite as spectacular as Christina had initially described. Richard explained the timeline, the projected returns, and the minimal risk factors with the practiced ease of someone who had made this presentation many times before. But as he spoke, I found myself studying Marcus and Christina more than focusing on the investment detail. I watched the way Marcus leaned forward when Richard discussed profit margins, the way Christina's eyes lit up when she calculated her share of the projected return. They were already spending money they didn't have, already planning how this investment would solve their financial pressures and perhaps fund their next vacation or home improvement project. They had no idea that the money I was about to invest represented only a tiny fraction of my actual financial resources, or that this would be the last favor I would ever do for them. When Richard finished his presentation, I asked a few thoughtful questions about the timeline and the legal structure of the investment. I requested copies of all documentation for my own records, explaining that I wanted to review everything carefully before signing any paper. Richard and Marcus seemed pleased by my thorough approach, interpreting it as the kind of due diligence that serious investors always conducted. I wrote a check for $50,000 that afternoon, knowing that Christina would see the transaction when she reviewed our shared account statement. I also knew that this would be the last time money would flow from my accounts to support their financial scheme. As we left the coffee shop, Christina thanked me repeatedly for making the investment possible. She talked excitedly about how this partnership would strengthen our family's financial foundation and create opportunities for future collaboration. Marcus was more reserved but equally pleased, mentioning that he had several other investment contacts who might present similar opportunities if this venture proved successful. They were already planning how to spend returns they hadn't earned from money that would soon be beyond their reach. Thursday passed quietly as I completed the final preparations for Friday's revelation. I confirmed my moving arrangements, reviewed the legal documentation James Morrison had prepared, and transferred additional funds from my inheritance account to ensure that my old checking account would have sufficient reserves for whatever financial discussions might emerge from Friday's confrontation. I also took time to write letters to several of my old friends from Millbrook, people I had lost touch with during my exile in Christina's basement. I wanted to re-establish those connections, to rebuild the social network that Christina and Marcus had gradually eroded through their subtle discouragement and logistical obstacles. Independence meant more than just financial freedom, it meant reclaiming my identity as Margaret Thornfield rather than simply existing as Christina's mother who needed to be managed and tolerated. Friday morning brought unexpected drama when Christina discovered that Marcus had been less than completely honest about his recent commission earnings. Apparently his sales performance had been declining for several months, and their household budget was under more pressure than she had realized. She confronted him in the kitchen while I was upstairs getting coffee, their voices rising as the discussion escalated into a full argument about money, responsibility, and honesty. As I listened to them blame each other for their financial difficulties, I couldn't help but think about how much of their recent stability had depended on my monthly contribution. Without my $2,000 in monthly payments, they would have been struggling to make their mortgage for months. Without my periodic contributions to their various emergencies and expenses, they would have had to make difficult choices about their lifestyle and spending priorities. They had been living beyond their means for years, using my financial support to maintain an illusion of prosperity that was about to be shattered. The argument ended with Marcus storming out of the house, claiming he needed to clear his head before our family dinner that evening. Christina retreated to her bedroom, where I could hear her making phone calls to her sister and her mother, seeking sympathy and advice about her financial worries. Neither of them seemed to consider that their financial difficulties were about to become significantly more challenging. That afternoon I received a call from the moving company confirming that they would arrive at 8 o'clock Monday morning to collect my furniture and personal belongings. The timing was perfect. Christina and Marcus would both be at work, giving me privacy to oversee the move without having to explain or justify my actions, until I was ready. I also received final confirmation from Westfield Gardens that my apartment would be ready for occupancy Monday evening. My new life was just 4 days away, but first I had to navigate the confrontation that would end my current living arrangement. Marcus returned home around 6 o'clock, apparently having resolved whatever internal conflict had driven him out of the house that morning. He apologized to Christina for his outburst, explaining that the stress of recent financial pressures had made him more irritable than usual. They embraced and made up with the kind of theatrical reconciliation that suggested they had performed this routine many times before. Dinner was pleasant on the surface, with Christina having prepared one of her better meals, and Marcus making an effort to be charming and attentive. They talked about the investment we had finalized on Wednesday, expressing optimism about the potential returns and gratitude for my participation in their financial plan. They also discussed their plans for the weekend, including a visit to Marcus's children and a social gathering with some of Christina's co-workers. As we finished the main course, Christina suggested that we move to the living room for dessert and coffee, creating a more comfortable setting for the family conversation I had requested. They were both relaxed and confident, apparently assuming that I wanted to discuss some minor household issue, or perhaps express appreciation for their care and support over the past 2 years. They had no idea what was coming. I waited until we were settled in the living room with our coffee before I began to speak. I started gently, thanking them for taking me into their home after Robert's death and acknowledging the ways they had tried to accommodate my needs during a difficult transition period. I expressed appreciation for the efforts they had made to include me in their family activities and financial planning. But then I shifted to a more serious tone, explaining that I had been doing some thinking about my long-term living situation and my financial independence. I mentioned that I had recently received some unexpected news about my financial circumstances, information that was going to change my ability to contribute to their household expenses. Christina and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly concerned about where this conversation was heading. Marcus asked if I was experiencing health problems or legal difficulties that might affect my income. Christina wondered if there were issues with my Social Security payments or medical insurance coverage. I reassured them that my health was fine and that there were no problems with my regular income sources. However, I explained, I had recently learned about an inheritance from a relative I had lost touch with years ago. The inheritance was substantial enough to change my financial situation significantly, and I had decided to use this windfall to establish my own independent living arrangement. The relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. They had been worried about losing my monthly financial contributions, but the prospect of an inheritance suggested that I might actually have more resources to share, rather than fewer. Christina asked excitedly about the amount of the inheritance and whether I had any plans for how to invest or manage the new money. This was the moment I had been planning for, the opportunity to reveal just how dramatically our relationship was about to change. I pulled out the bank statement from my new account, the one showing the balance of $1.3 million that had been deposited 10 days earlier. I placed it on the coffee table, where both Christina and Marcus could see it clearly, watching their expressions change from curiosity to shock, to something that might have been described as desperate calculation. Christina reached for the statement with trembling hands, reading the numbers several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his face going pale as he processed the magnitude of the inheritance I had received. $1.3 million. Christina whispered, her voice barely audible. Mom, this is incredible. This changes everything for all of us. But I shook my head gently, taking the bank statement back and returning it to my purse. Actually, Christina, this changes everything for me. Not for us. For me. The distinction seemed to confuse them initially. Marcus asked what I meant, whether there were restrictions on the inheritance that prevented me from sharing it with family members. Christina wondered if I needed help managing such a large sum of money, suggesting that they could assist with investment planning and financial decisions. I stood up from the couch and walked to the window, looking out at the small backyard where I had spent so many hours feeling trapped and powerless. When I turned back to face them, I made sure my voice was calm but unmistakably firm. I've used part of this inheritance to secure an apartment at Westfield Gardens, the senior living community near the mall. I'll be moving out on Monday. My new living arrangement will give me the independence and dignity that I need at this stage of my life. The silence that followed was deafening. Christina and Marcus stared at me as if I had announced that I was moving to Mars. Finally, Christina found her voice. But Mom, why would you want to live in one of those places when you have a family who loves you? We can modify the house to give you more space and privacy. We can rearrange things so you're more comfortable here. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, suddenly full of ideas for home improvements that would make my basement bedroom more appealing. They could install better lighting, improve the heating system, perhaps even add a small kitchenette so I would have more independence within their home. I listened to their desperate suggestions with something approaching pity. They were offering to make minimal improvements to my living situation, while maintaining the fundamental power dynamic that had made me feel like an unwelcome guest in their home for 2 years. I appreciate the offers, I said quietly, but I've already made my decision. Westfield Gardens will give me my own apartment, my own space and my own life. I won't be sleeping on couches during holidays or hiding in the basement when you have company. I'll be Margaret Thornfield again, not just Christina's mother who needs to be managed. Christina's eyes filled with tears, and she began to protest that they had never made me feel unwelcome, that they had always considered me a valued member of their family. Marcus added that they had done their best to accommodate my needs within the constraints of their small house and busy lifestyle, but I was no longer interested in their rationalizations and excuses. Let me tell you what I've learned over the past 2 years, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. I've learned that I contributed over $48,000 to this household through my monthly payments alone. I've learned that I've funded your emergencies, your home improvements, your vacation to Mexico, and your various investment schemes to the tune of another $60,000. I've learned that I've been paying rent to sleep on a couch and live in a basement while you've used my money to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't afford on your own. The numbers seemed to hit them like physical blows. Christina started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop her. I've also learned that you plan to send me to a psychiatric facility when I was vulnerable after my fall, and that you've been intercepting my mail to prevent me from learning about opportunities like this inherit. I've learned that you've isolated me from my friends and my former life, because independent connections might have interfered with your financial control over me. Marcus finally found his voice, stammering that they had never intended to exploit me, that their suggestions had always been presented as mutually beneficial arrangements. Christina added that they had genuinely believed they were helping me navigate the challenges of aging and providing me with family support during a difficult time. I walked back to the couch and sat down, looking directly at both of them as I prepared to deliver the final element of my revelation. Here's what's going to happen next, I said, my voice calm but unmistakably authoritative. I'm moving out on Monday, and my financial support for this household ends immediately. You'll need to figure out how to make your mortgage payments and cover your expenses without my $2,000 per month. You'll need to find new ways to fund your emergencies and investment opportunities. Christina started to cry, but whether from genuine emotion or calculated manipulation, I couldn't tell, and no longer cared. But Mom, she sobbed, we're family. We can work this out. We can change the arrangement so you feel more valued and respected. Don't you want to help your daughter and grandchildren have financial security? I looked at her tear-streaked face and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete emotional detachment from her attempts to manipulate me. Christina, you're 38 years old. Marcus is 42. You're both capable adults who should be managing your own financial affairs without depending on your elderly mother to subsidize your lifestyle. It's time for you to learn to live within your means instead of using me as your personal bank account. Marcus tried a different approach, suggesting that my sudden independence might be a mistake, that managing such a large inheritance required experience and family support that I might not have on my own. He offered to help me find professional financial advisors who could ensure that my money was properly invested and protected. I almost laughed at the irony of receiving financial advice from someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck while spending my money to maintain an illusion of prosperity. I already have professional financial advice, I replied. I have a lawyer, a financial advisor, and a clear plan for how I want to spend my remaining years. None of that plan involves subsidizing your household expenses or sleeping on your couch during holidays. The reality of their situation was beginning to penetrate their shock and denial. Without my monthly contributions, they would be facing immediate financial pressure. Their mortgage payment alone was more than Marcus's irregular commission income could reliably cover. The credit card debt they had accumulated, despite my periodic contributions to pay it down, would become unmanageable without my financial cushion. Christina asked desperately if I would consider continuing to help them financially even if I moved out, perhaps providing a smaller monthly contribution until they could adjust their budget to accommodate the loss of my support. Marcus suggested that they could formalize our arrangement as a loan rather than a gift, providing me with interest payments and a clear timeline for repayment. But I was done being their financial solution to problems they had created through their own poor planning and overspending. The only financial arrangement we'll have going forward, I said, standing up to signal that our conversation was ending, is the repayment of the money you've taken from me under false pretenses over the past 2 years. I pulled out the legal documentation that James Morrison had prepared, placing it on the coffee table next to where the bank statement had been. The papers outlined my intention to recover the approximately $108,000 I had contributed to their household and personal expenses since moving in with them. Marcus grabbed the papers and read them quickly, his face growing paler with each page. Christina looked over his shoulder, her tears stopping abruptly as she realized the legal implications of what I was presenting. You can't be serious, Marcus said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. That money was given freely. You participated in household decisions about how to spend it. You can't just decide retroactively that you want it back. I smiled at him with the kind of calm confidence that comes from having excellent legal advice and unlimited financial resources to pursue justice. Actually, Marcus, my lawyer has reviewed the circumstances under which I made those financial contributions, and he believes I have several strong legal arguments for recovery. Money given under duress or false pretenses is generally recoverable, especially when there's a pattern of exploitation of an elderly person by family members. Christina found her voice again, but the manipulative sweetness was gone, replaced by raw panic. "Mom, you can't do this to us. We'll lose the house. Marcus will have to declare bankruptcy. You'll be destroying your own family over money." I looked at her with genuine sadness, not for the consequences she was facing, but for the person she had revealed herself to. "Christina, you destroyed this family when you decided to treat me like a financial resource rather than a human being, deserving of respect and dignity. I'm not taking anything away from you. I'm simply reclaiming what was mine to begin with." I gathered my purse and the legal papers, preparing to leave the living room that had been the site of so many uncomfortable conversations over the past 2 years. "You have until Wednesday to respond to the legal demand for repayment," I continued. "My lawyer recommends that you retain your own legal counsel to discuss your options. I'll be moving out Monday morning while you're both at work, so we won't need to have any further discussions about the logistics of my departure." As I reached the doorway, Christina called after me with a desperate final plea. "Mom, please, we're sorry if we made you feel unappreciated. We can change. We can make this work better for everyone." I turned back to look at them one last time, these two people who had systematically dismantled my independence and dignity while convincing themselves they were doing me a favor. "Christina, you had 2 years to make me feel appreciated and valued. You chose instead to make me feel like a burden, who should be grateful for the privilege of subsidizing your lifestyle. It's too late for apologies and promises. I'm finally in a position to choose how I want to live, and I choose to live somewhere else." I spent that weekend in a hotel near Westfield Gardens, partly to give Christina and Marcus space to process what had happened, but mostly because I couldn't bear to spend another night in that basement bedroom, knowing that my liberation was so close at hand. Saturday morning, I received a series of increasingly frantic phone calls from Christina. She had spent the night researching the legal implications of my demand for repayment, and she was beginning to understand that I had both the resources and the legal standing to make their lives very difficult if they chose to fight me. She offered a series of compromises and partial settlements, suggesting that they could repay the money gradually over several years, or that we could negotiate a reduced amount that would be easier for them to manage. She also hinted that Marcus was exploring the possibility of borrowing against his retirement account or taking out a second mortgage on the house to raise the funds for repayment. I listened to her proposals with polite disinterest, explaining that my lawyer would handle all further negotiations and that any settlement discussions would need to go through proper legal channels. I was no longer interested in private family conversations about money. Too many of those discussions had resulted in my being manipulated and exploited. Sunday afternoon, Marcus called with a different approach. He had apparently been researching my legal claims, and believed that I would have difficulty proving that my financial contributions had been made under duress or false pretense. He suggested that a lengthy legal battle would be expensive and stressful for all of us, and that it might be better to simply agree to disagree about the past, and focus on moving forward as a family. I couldn't help but admire his attempt to negotiate from a position of weakness, but I was no longer the accommodating woman who had been willing to accept their terms for the sake of family harmony. "Marcus," I said quietly, "you seem to be operating under the impression that I need to prove anything to you or justify my actions. I have $1.3 million and excellent legal representation. You have a mortgage you can't afford and a pattern of financial dependence on elderly family members. If you want to fight this in court, I'm prepared to spend whatever it takes to establish the precedent that exploiting seniors has consequences." The silence on the other end of the line told me that Marcus was beginning to understand the reality of his situation. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything feel possible and new. I met the movers at Christina's house at 8 o'clock sharp, directing them to collect the furniture and personal belongings I had accumulated during my 2 years in exile. Most of my possessions fit easily into a small moving truck, a reminder of how little space I had been allowed to occupy in their home. Christina had left a note on the kitchen counter expressing her sadness about my decision, and her hope that we could eventually reconcile our differences. She also mentioned that they were consulting with a lawyer about my financial demands, and that they hoped to reach an amicable settlement that would preserve our family relationship. I left my own note on the kitchen counter thanking them for their hospitality over the past 2 years, and wishing them luck with their future financial planning. I also left the keys to the house and a forwarding address for any legal correspondence that might be necessary. By noon, I was standing in my new apartment at Westfield Gardens, surrounded by my familiar furniture in a space that was truly mine for the first time in 2 years. The apartment was bright and spacious, with large windows that looked out onto landscaped gardens, where other residents were walking and talking and enjoying the sunshine. That evening, I had dinner in the community dining room, sitting at a table with 3 other women who welcomed me warmly and invited me to join their weekly bridge game. We talked about books and travel and current events, the kind of conversations I had been starving for during my exile in Christina's basement. For the first time in years, I felt like Margaret Thornfield again, a woman with her own interests and opinions and resources, rather than just Christina's mother who needed to be managed and tolerated. Over the next few weeks, Christina and Marcus's lawyer contacted James Morrison several times, attempting to negotiate a reduced settlement and extended payment timeline, but I was no longer interested in making their lives easier or accepting partial justice for the exploitation I had endured. Eventually, they agreed to repay the full amount I had demanded, using a combination of borrowed funds and the liquidation of some investments that Marcus had been reluctant to sell. The repayment was completed within 60 days, transferring $108,000 back to my accounts along with additional funds to cover my legal expenses. I used part of the recovered money to take a cruise to Alaska, something Robert and I had always planned to do but never found the time for. I used more of it to establish a scholarship fund at the community college where I had taken evening classes years ago, providing educational opportunities for older women who wanted to start new careers or pursue delayed dreams. But mostly, I used the money to build the independent, dignified life I should have been living all along. 6 months after leaving Christina's house, I received a Christmas card from her with a brief note expressing hope that we could rebuild our relationship and perhaps spend some holidays together in the future. The card included photos of Marcus's children, now noticeably older, and a cheerful update about their family activities and accomplishments. I sent a polite thank you note in response, but I didn't include an invitation to visit or a suggestion that we plan any future family gathering. Some relationships can be repaired after betrayal and exploitation, but others are too fundamentally damaged to rebuild. Christina and Marcus had taught me an important lesson about the difference between family members who love you and family members who use you. They had also taught me that financial independence isn't just about having money. It's about having the freedom to choose who deserves access to your time, energy, and resources. I never did sleep on their couch again, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had to sell their house the following year when Marcus's job situation became even more unstable. Apparently, they had grown too dependent on my financial contributions to maintain their lifestyle without them, and the debt they had accumulated to repay my settlement had left them with limited options for dealing with their ongoing expenses. I might have felt sorry for them if they had learned anything from the experience, but according to my sources, they were already exploring the possibility of moving in with Marcus's elderly parents, who apparently had some savings that could help them get back on their feet. Some people never learn that exploiting family members isn't a sustainable financial strategy. As for me, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity and independence, and that having the resources to choose your own life is the greatest gift you can give yourself. Christmas at Westfield Gardens was everything that Christmas on Christina's couch had never been: warm, welcoming, and filled with people who appreciated my presence rather than tolerating it as an inconvenience. I woke up in my own bed, in my own apartment, surrounded by my own things, and spent the day with people who had chosen to include me in their celebration rather than reluctantly accommodating my existence. It was the best Christmas gift I had ever given myself, the gift of freedom from people who had confused love with exploitation, and family with financial opportunity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.